But if I can get these notes back to British intelligence in time, it could stop millions more from dying. It could stop the war.
War? What war?
The war. The war to end all wars. 4 years. 27 countries, 25 million dead. Soldiers and civilians. Innocent people. Women and children slaughtered. Their homes and their villages looted and burned. Oh, weapons far deadlier than you can ever imagine. Oh, it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's like the world's gonna end.
Okay, everybody, in addition to interest groups, this week we're going to talk about World War I, which is Chapter 4 of the Reeves book. World War I, the Great War, or the War to End All Wars. So our objectives for this class is that we're going to learn about the causes. We're going to talk about how the U.S. got involved in World War I. We're going to talk a little bit about moral concerns. We're going to also talk about financial concerns. We're going to discuss the naval warfare incidents that helped push the United States into World War I. We're going to talk about the Zimmerman telegram, which is another factor. We're going to talk about the growth in government. And we're going to learn, about World War I, because that's my objective out of this, because sometimes World War II is studied a lot more and is a little bit more, has a little bit more notoriety. But I also kind of think as World War I as a forgotten war as well, because we tend to not focus on it as much as we do World War II. So World War I occurred between July 1914 and November 11th, 1918. Before the war, before the United States got involved in the war, in fact, they were really stunned to learn that the war was going on in Europe, and we'll get into some of that. By the end of the war, we had over 17 million people killed, including over 100,000 Americans. And as we learned last week, the United States was a world power by the time World War I started, due to a lot of its territorial gains in the Caribbean and some places in the Pacific, and even all the way going back to 1849 when the United States entered into the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the United States a lot of territory in the West. I found this really cool graphic on the internet that can kind of help us understand the causes of World War I. The acronym is MANIA, right? So if we look at the M, militarism. This is the policy of building up a strong military to prepare for war, and also kind of to protect yourselves, and also to use that as a tool for diplomacy. Alliances, having partnerships with other countries, having strong international relations with other countries, where we have agreements between these countries to provide aid and come to each other's aid if we're attacked. Nationalism, which is not to be confused with patriotism. Nationalism is an extreme pride in one's country, where your national interest should be placed above international affairs. And I also like to add to that, where you might be willing to compromise your values for the betterment of your country. Imperialism, where one country takes over another country economically and politically. Star Wars, right? The Imperials take over the Republic in some of the earlier Star Wars movies. If you ever want to talk about it, we can set up a Zoom office hour, and I'll be glad to go over the politics of Star Wars on our own time. And also the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which kind of sparked the start of World War I. And this is a good illustration of a political cartoon that I found, where you have all of the kindling that were some of the reasons that World War I started. An incident in Sarajevo serves as the match, and then we have the arms race as well as nationalistic movements kind of fanning the flames to help start World War I. So let's talk about some of the causes. We'll establish the sides first. The Allies were composed of Great Britain, France, and Russia. The Central Powers were composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which included Turkey and some other Middle Eastern countries. We have a map on the next slide, so you should be able to see it in detail. Both had been competing for power since the late 19th century. And here's an illustration, and I think this is a good photo because it gives us a timeline as well as a color-coded map to see who was on whose side. So the orange, the light reddish orange, are the neutral nations. The light green are the allies, or the Triple Entente. And the Central Powers are the light purple, or the Triple Alliance. We're going to use Central Powers and allies instead of what the other definitions they have for them. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see a timeline of events. We're going to kind of go over some of this too as a group, and we will look at points in World War I that were significant and led to the end of it. So then one of the main causes of World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was an heir to the Austrian-Hungary throne. He was killed by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated him. 1 month later after that, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And within a week, we started to see a coalesce of nations coming together to engage in war, where Russia, France, Belgium, Great Britain, and Serbia had sided against Austria-Hungary, Germany, and as we know, the Great War, as it was originally called, started and was underway. Here's a photo, or a painting of a photo of Princip killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So before getting into World War I, the United States wanted to stay isolationist. And when we get to World War II, we're going to kind of talk about the same sentiment, that the United States didn't want to get involved into World War II because of the atrocities of World War I. It's kind of the same belief here. America wanted to stay isolationist. However, public sympathy were with the Allies. Most of Americans were of British descent and shared that British history, kind of that language, that culture. Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, was quietly pro-Allies. Many Americans associated Germany with autocracy, kind of a militarism type imperial government. We have that visions of the spiked helmet that I have on the right here. And their whole kind of goal of an international expansion, taking over countries. Germany invaded neutral Belgium and Luxembourg in an attempt to capture Paris quickly by catching the French off guard. French would have been surprised that neutral countries were being invaded. And this led to the belief that in the U.S. that the Central Powers had initiated this conflict. And right here we have a political cartoon of a bully with a big stick picking on a person that is smaller and really having no way out of it. This would be significant. This would be significant to having Germany on this side and Belgium right here. So I think this is a good little political cartoon that kind of illustrates the threat that Germany had against the smaller countries. There was some support of the Central Powers in the U.S. We had a lot of German immigrants that lived here in the United States, 8 million of them. We also had 4 million Irish Americans who were hostile to the British. And there were also American Jews here, and they had hatred of Russian anti-Semitism. So when we talk about financial support before entering World War I, the Allies, they had received exports from the United States that rose from $825 million in 1914 to $3.2 billion in 1916. War is a boom for business here in the United States, and we'll kind of see that as we go along in history. Munitions, whether it be military weapons, ammunition, equipment, technology, all of these sales totaled $1.7 billion. And remember, this is going to be 1914 money. During this time, England had borrowed $1 billion from the United States, so it was kind of evident that the United States involvement in this war was going to be inevitable, and it was also kind of evident that the United States was going to be on the side of the Allies. Here's a good graph of amount of exports in dollars from 1914 to 1916. You can see Britain going from $594 million up to $1.5 billion in 1916. And again, I kind of want to stress these are 1914, 15, and 16 numbers. So, you know, the value now would be a lot more than it is here. France, same thing. We see exports in France going up in dollars significantly. But then we also see Germany, the amount of exports going to them is dropping a lot. We'll look at some of the causes of that in a little bit, but just kind of keep in mind that there was kind of a directive to not deal directly with the Central Powers. The Central Powers, they weren't able to trade with the U.S. due to a British blockade, and private bankers were reluctant to lend money to the Central Powers. Naval war and hostilities toward the United States existed. Now, after this, I'm going to attach a pretty cool video that I found when I went to the Smithsonian in June of 2021. I was able to go to Washington, D.C. and see some of the artifacts that came out of World War II and World War I. And I saw a really, really good video that illustrated the Lusitania incident. And I'll attach it here so we can also kind of get it in view where we could see things happening with our eyes instead of looking at text right here. But Germany had made it clear that the U-boats would not follow international law and would attack on sight. Wilson was not too happy with this because he felt that if Germany did this, they were crossing a line, right? And there would be strict accountability if American vessels or lives were lost. A German U-boat or a submarine, sank the British liner the Lusitania on May 15, 1915. This killed 1,959 people, including 128 Americans. So this was a very significant loss of life. So if you look at this, here is a picture of the Lusitania. And what it looked like kind of looks like the Titanic. You know, it was built around the same time. The Titanic sank in 1912. This sunk in 1915. It shows you the path right here. It shows you the amount of people that were killed. It shows you how long it took to sink, which was only 18 minutes. The depth of the water, which is 300 feet. And it carried 173 tons of ammunition and shells on board. Here's a little bit of a timeline. It was launched in 1906. It sailed on its main voyage on 1907. And it was torpedoed and sunk in 1915. And here is an illustration of the sub, or the German U-boat that sunk the Lusitania. The Germans sunk the French vessel, the Sussex, in the English Channel on March 19th. As a result of this, President Wilson threatened to sever diplomatic relations with Germany unless the German government refrained from attacking all passenger ships. This was known as the Sussex Pledge, and Germany originally accepted the terms and conditions of this pledge, but we're going to see as we go on, they didn't stick to it. The German administration argued among themselves that they really did not need to abide by the Sussex Pledge because they felt that the United States was clearly on the side of the Allies. Next, German ambassador to the United States, Count Johann von Bernstorff, presented our Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, a note declaring Germany's intention to restart warfare. This dismayed Wilson. Here is kind of a list of other vessels that were attacked from 1917, from February of 1917 to April of 1917. One of the ones that I want you to take note of is the Aztec. Obviously, our San Diego State mascot, which is my school that I went to, so good to see that. But this freighter was sunk, and on April 1st, 28 people were killed, and 11 of those were Americans. And that was the tipping point of getting the United States into the war. During this time, Congress had doubled the size of the regular army. Remember, we had a relatively small army at this time. They federalized the National Guard and gave it an authorized strength of 440,000. They appropriated $313 million to strengthen our Navy and agreed to spend $50 million to build merchant ships, and this saw the birth of the modern-day merchant marine. Going back to the section, I'm going to post a video underneath this link regarding the Lusitania. It's a BBC story about the sinking, and historians go into it. So I want you all to look at it. So after you watch this video, check the YouTube link below this, and it is the BBC story that I wanted to include. Okay, the next thing we're going to discuss is the Zimmermann telegram, or the Zimmermann cable, or the Zimmermann note. Wilson had asked Congress to declare war in April of 1917 when the German Empire resumed submarine warfare and sent the Zimmermann telegram. He felt that we had to do this to make the world safe for democracy. So basically, the Zimmermann telegram was a decoded message that was intercepted, where it showed that Germany was trying to get Mexico to form an alliance and to get into a war with the United States. However, this was intercepted by British intelligence. The message came in the form of a coded telegram that was dispatched by Arthur Zimmermann, who was a top-level civil servant in the Foreign Office of the German Empire. The telegram said that if Germany went to war with the U.S., Germany promised to help Mexico recover the territory it had lost in the 1840s as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They would have Texas, New Mexico, California, and Arizona returned to them. Basically, the contents of the telegram said that Germany had intended unrestricted submarine warfare on the United States. They had hoped that the United States would be neutral, but they knew that wasn't going to happen, so they proposed an alliance with Mexico, and they said they would be able to recoup the land that they lost. They would also kind of suggested adding Japan to it as well, but this obviously was intercepted, and the United States found out about it. After the sinking of the Aztec and the interception of the telegram, the United States declared war on April 6, 1917. And if you click on this YouTube video that I have embedded, it shows Wilson asking Congress to declare war on the Central Powers. Now, when we talk about the Zimmermann telegram a little bit, the question that is asked is, why didn't Mexico take Germany up on that offer? Mexico was in the midst of a civil war at the time, and Venustiano Carranza, who was president at the time, his position was far from secure. And the United States obviously had a far stronger military than Mexico, and even if Mexican forces had been completely united, they really posed no serious threat to the United States. Okay, during this time we also saw the rise of pacifism. Some people refused to fight in the war, and they became known as conscientious objectors, which would be a term that we would hear years later used in other wars. About 7,000 of them refused to fight. They were placed in non-combat roles, like driving ambulances, moving troops on gurneys or stretchers. And a lot of these people were either socialists, anarchists, or Christian pacifists. So we also saw war boards, and the war forced the federal government to exercise like an unprecedented power over the nation's economy. Trade, industry, and labor vital to the military effort had to be supervised and coordinated by the government, therefore resulting in a larger government. At first, Wilson had appointed a Council for National Defense to handle this gigantic task. The council in turn created a number of agencies led chiefly by businessmen to deal with a lot of these vital areas. We have the Food Administration here. That was authorized by the Lever Act of 1917, which was headed by Herbert Hoover, who was a wealthy mining engineer. He encouraged production, supervised food exports and imports, organized governmental corporations to purchase the nation's wheat and sugar crops. We had rations where we had to have things like Meatless Tuesday or Wheatless Wednesday, where we would refrain from eating some of these foods so these foods could be rationed and sent to the soldiers that were fighting. Largely through these voluntary efforts and without rationing, the nation's agriculture production rose as a result. We also saw the Fuel Administration, which was headed by Harry Garfield, who was the son of the 20th president. And this stimulated the production of coal by raising its prices. And under this, we also saw rations too, where gasless Sundays and heatless Mondays were put in effect. And the government leased their railroads and operated them as a single system. This was important because the new agencies were able to design ways they could oversee production and distribution. This existed from July 17th to December 1918, and coordinated and channeled production in the U.S. by setting priorities, fixing prices, which was something that was controversial, and standardizing products to support the war efforts of the United States and its allies. And in turn, a lot of these businessmen were reaping high profits out of this. Workers also benefited a lot from this condition and enjoyed the friendship of federal authorities, as unions were looked on as more positive. And union membership even grew by more than 2 million during that era. Now, Wilson also had an influence. He passed the Selective Service Act, using conscription to send 10,000 soldiers per day to France by the summer of 1918. Conscription is a fancy word for a draft. So this is where our draft came into play. On the home front, he raised income taxes, borrowed billions of dollars through the use of bonds, specifically the purchase of Liberty bonds. Bonds are a way that governments can finance things quickly. They usually don't have enough cash on hand to be able to maybe put money into a project immediately. So what they do is they sell bonds where the government will give you a piece of paper. You'll give them money, we'll say $25. So you buy a bond for $25. The government takes that $25 and then uses it for a public works project or maybe even a war like we're talking about. And you get a maturity date on that bond, and when that bond matures, you can take it to the government and they'll give you your money back with a little bit of interest. Now, you're not going to make a lot of money on bonds. These are very safe investments, but they have a low rate of return. He also asked Congress to limit civil liberties by implementing the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which would suppress anti-draft activists. Here is the classic Uncle Sam, I want you for the U.S. Army. Go to your nearest recruiting station. So about 4,649 local draft boards existed that were staffed by civilians. They registered 24 men from the age of 18 to 45 and provided nearly 3 million of the armed forces, all but 8,000 to the Army. During these 18 months, we also saw enlistments. About 2 million men join the join the armed service voluntarily. Now, there was an argument whether or not the draft was a violation of the 13th Amendment. Remember, the 13th Amendment prohibits involuntary servitude. So in the case of Arver versus the United States, it examined whether or not conscription was a violation of the 13th Amendment. eventually it was found that it wasn't, and the Congress was in power, it was in their power to be able to use the draft through what we call the necessary and proper clause. We talked a little bit about that in federalism, how the government can pass, the Congress could pass a law if they can and fit it in the necessary and proper clause. If they can justify it, helps them achieve one of their enumerated powers. And they also the court also found that the draft was necessary for national defense and national security. Here is a soldier in his draft card. So the war cost Americans about $32 billion, and about $7 billion of that was on loan to the Allies. Most of that sum was spent here in the U.S., so we saw a lot of prosperity. The federal government had borrowed about 2/3 of the war costs from the public, and we saw massive drives for bonds, whether it's the Liberty Bonds or a Victory Loan program in April 1919 that was very popular. So we also saw the curtailing of civil liberties that we mentioned earlier. The Espionage Act of 1917 imposed stiff fines and sentences on persons who interfered with recruiting or made false statements obstructing the war effort. It also authorized the Postmaster General to ban printed materials he considered to be treasonous. Now, if we look at this and we try to maybe understand some of this, you're putting the power into the hands of a person to determine whether or not something is treasonable. That could potentially be really subjective. So it gave the Postmaster General a lot of power. I can see the point of the first section, maybe preventing people from interfering with the recruiting or making false statements obstructing the war. Maybe the first part is not a violation of constitutional privileges, but maybe making false statements obstructing the war effort, depending what those statements are, there may be a First Amendment violation in there. Now, we look at the Sedition Act. This could be considered a First Amendment violation. And I think one of the things that we talk about in the course of this class is that anytime there are, wars or catastrophes or terrorist attacks, we can pretty much get some of our civil liberties curtailed. And the Sedition Act is an example of this, where it made it a crime to, quote, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the Constitution, the armed forces, or the flag. Now, I really want you all to think about this. Do you believe this to be a First Amendment violation? So it's just kind of a critical thinking thing that I want you all to do. And when you're listening to this and watching the video, sit back and think, could this be a violation of my First Amendment rights? Because I think a lot of the times we tend to, no matter who's in power, we tend to be critical of the government. And would that fall into what the Sedition Act did? Okay, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to splice a video into this. It's historians talking about the Sedition Act, and it's from NBC, so I think it's a really good resource that we can use to help understand what the Sedition Act led to. Women. Women participated in the war effort. Women found new employment opportunities. A lot of men were at war, so they filled their jobs. They did work like police work, factory work, conducting streetcars. Their wages increased by about 20%, but they stayed mostly in traditionally female jobs like nursing or maybe school teaching. After the war, many women lost their jobs to men because the men came back and they took their jobs back while the women went into the homes. So at that time, maybe about 25% of the women in the United States worked. The rest were homemakers. African Americans really contributed to the war as well. Black leaders had encouraged and endorsed America's war effort. More than 400,000 African Americans served in the Army. They were still segregated, and three-fourths of them were laborers. But the Army created a single Negro division for overseas duty, but placed whites in kind of these supervisorial positions. For those of you that might have been in the military, you can probably imagine what some of, maybe the hierarchy in the military, what positions the whites were placed in. Okay, anytime we talk about war, there's always going to be fronts established. And when we talk about fronts, that basically means the division between enemies. So you have kind of an imaginary demarcation down, and one side is fighting against the other. So on the Western Front, there's a really good movie from the 30s called All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a little bit dated, but it's still interesting if you want to watch it. It's about World War I. By March 1918, there were fewer than 300,000 Americans in France who were all inadequately equipped. Older weapons. Some were getting sick. Then reinforcements began to arrive, and by July 1st of that year, we saw 1 million American troops on the Western Front. And slightly more than 4 months later, the war was over. In March 1918, the Germans launched a massive spring offensive by June 1st that left them only 50 miles from Paris. The American Expeditionary Force troops fought valiantly in some battles such as Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood and helped the French halt the German attack. On July 18th, the Allied armies launched a counterattack that turned the tide of the war. And here's a good illustration of the lines, the German line here, no man land here, and the British line here. And this is the front. This is what's called the front. So a very dangerous area. And here's just some illustrations before going over the top in these kind of garrisons or things that are built in. And some good illustrations is a soldier helping his buddy out. And then the soldier fighting. So in late September, facing an invasion of their own country, Germany decided to begin the press for peace or an armistice. On October 6th, they contacted President Wilson and requested an immediate ceasefire or a suspension of hostilities. So, before it was over, 30 sovereign states would become involved, 4 empires would be overthrown, and 7 new nations would be born. And we'll look at the maps in a little bit. Some 30 million people lost their lives. Half of them were civilians, half of them were non-combatants, and they were lost to this unprecedented slaughter. On November 11th, the Great War, as it's called, came to an end. America has lost 112,432. More than half of that was from disease. And 230,000 were wounded. The European casualties, of course, were far, far, far greater. Germany suffered 1.8 million deaths. Russia, 1.7. France, 1.38. Austria-Hungary, 1.2. The British Commonwealth, 947,000, and Italy, 460,000. So we had to decide what type of diplomacy was needed in order to press for peace. So the most important of the peace treaties of World War I is the Treaty of Versailles, and it ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. It was signed on June 20th, 1919, and it conflicted with something that Wilson was trying to implement called his 14 points. Wilson had a presence of, or a feeling of idealism, where Woodrow Wilson and his famous 14 points were needed for him to be able to create world peace if it was implemented. If you click on this link, you will see the whole text of the 14 points. I'm not going to put it up here because it would be kind of redundant. So let's go ahead and look at some of these points. So out of the 14 points, he advocated for an open covenant instead of secret treaties, kind of a view of transparency, wanted freedom of navigations on the sea, removing economic barriers on trade, having an impartial adjustment of colonial claims, and a general association of nations to achieve world peace. When Wilson originally addressed Congress 18 months earlier, he spoke that the United States need to make the world safe for democracy. About a year later, his sentiment remained strong, and he articulated in a speech to Congress where he introduced his 14 points. These are going to be used as kind of a guideline of rebuilding after the war, and these points included kind of Wilson's ideas regarding how nations should conduct themselves with regards to foreign policy, freedom of the seas, free trade, and the concept of national self-determination. So we look at some of the points here. Again, open covenants instead of secret treaties, freedom of the seas, removal of economic barriers, reduction of weapons, impartial adjustments of colonial claims, and a general association of nations to achieve world peace. Wilson had his key points of Wilsonianism, where, emphasizing self-determination of people, spreading democracy, spreading capitalism, being opposition to isolationism, and in favor of interventionism if our allies or us were in need. So one of Wilson's 14 points called for a creation of a General Association of Nations, or the League of Nations. The United States Senate refused to ratify the League of Nations, Article 10, which required members of the League of Nations to come to the aid of other nations in the League when they were attacked. Many senators, including Harry Cabot Lodge, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, worried that this provision might drag the United States into unnecessary wars and also impede on America's freedom of action. They wanted the treaty ratified, but they had some reservations known as the Lodge reservations, stating that the United States should not be obligated to intervene should a member nation of the League of Nations be attacked. The League of Nations was kind of a predecessor to the United Nations that we saw develop after World War II. There was some conflict between the points in the treaty. It didn't guarantee self-determination. Italy was given a territory composed of 200,000 Austrian Germans, and new countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia had different nationalities. Also, the treaty omitted Wilsonian concepts of free trade, freedom of the navigation of the seas, open covenants, and disarmament. Wilson never really explained what he meant by self-determination, but most people perceived it meaning to be an identified grouping of people that should have liberty to create government it would like. And deep conflicts occur upon implementation, where determinations must be made on what identifies a grouping of people. So what rights are provided with liberty? It was never really noted by Wilson what he meant by self-determination. In fact, there was a book written by Margaret Macmillan called Paris 1919 that looked into the situation that was happening during that time. And Richard Holbrooke, who was a diplomat and ambassador in the Obama administration, had this quote: "One thing is clear. As Wilson arrived in France in December 1918, he ignited great hope that the world, with his stirring 14 points, especially the groundbreaking concept of self-determination, yet Wilson seemed vague as to what his own phrase actually meant." End quote. That's from Richard Holbrooke, who was a diplomat under the Obama administration. So there's really no clear example of what self-determination meant by Wilson. A lot of people perceived it to mean an identified grouping of people who should have the liberty to create the government how it would like. But it was never really defined. So we look at here's a map of Europe in 1914, around the start of the war. You can see Germany here, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey, and some other Middle Eastern countries. Then we have the Russian Empire up here, and the France, Italy, United Kingdom, and Portugal. If you look at the 1919 map, you can see the result of this. Soviet Russia, which later became the USSR, which we'll talk about when we get into the 50s and the 60s. In the 40s, obviously. A lot of these other smaller Russian countries. Eastern Europe. These new countries: Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland. And then Western Europe. So the Treaty of Versailles could also, maybe you can make the argument that this was one of the reasons that World War II started as well. We'll talk more about that when we get into World War II. One provision was that Germans had to sign a war guilt clause. So that included $32 billion in reparations. Germany can only have a 100,000 man army, no navy, and it took 92 years to pay off, and they finally paid it off in 1910. So a lot of this economic turmoil kind of hurt Germany, along with the Great Depression. And, we all know with Hitler coming to power, one of the reasons he came to power was due to Germany's economic situation, who he blamed on people in other demographic groups that we'll get into. But, yeah. So some criticisms of the treaty were that the ratification struggled. Some felt that it was too lenient. It also created that League of Nations that some of the people in America did not want to be a part of. Wilson also had a debilitating stroke. Not a lot of people knew about this. He lost the functioning of his whole left side, and therefore he was kind of unable to campaign for the passage. But eventually it was passed on January 10th, 1920. So this is World War I. I hope you learned something about this. I think World War I is maybe, like I said, the forgotten war. A lot of people don't necessarily look at it in as much reverence as maybe we do World War II. But I always think it's good to learn a little bit about history and these things that... So what I want you to do is I want you to watch the video of the Lusitania. It is going to be posted under the link for this lecture in the module sections that we have. So make sure you watch it. There may be some test questions on it. So it's only about 8 minutes, and it'll help this lecture that we had. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you all. You all doing great. Keep up the good work.